done several times in the past, and I think my wife has even written for the Integrated Catholic website. So we have a relationship that goes back now quite a number of years, and it's good to always rekindle that. So, yeah, I'm going to speak this morning, as Randy has said, on the theme of how history is his story. And I want to sort of set the scene here. Obviously, we have an election on the horizon, which, all elections can be seen as important and maybe even crucial, but I think we would all agree this one is particularly important and crucial just because of the nature of the times in which we find ourselves and the various things going on in our society. So it's very easy to suffer from what I sort of call pre-election tension syndrome. And we all find ourselves under a cloud of stress because what's going to happen, and if the election goes this way or that way, what sort of world are we going to find ourselves in next year? So all of these are concerns, and I think the important thing is for us to see the bigger picture, to actually understand, regardless of who wins the next election, what's the world going to be like next year, 10 years from now, 100 years from now. Okay. And the two key questions that need to be asked and answered in order to understand history is, who is God? The first question, and the most important. And then the second question is, who are we? And if we get those two questions, answer those two questions correctly, everything's going to fall into place, and that we'll realize that, I don't say we'll be free of stress. We're human beings, but we will see something which transcends the stress and allows us to see above the surface rather than feeling ourselves drowning underneath it. So the first thing about God, I mean, the divine attributes that are applied to God are omnipotence, omniscience, and omnipresence. And that God is omnipotent. He's all powerful. He's omniscient. He's all knowing. Where we get the word science is from the Latin scientia, which just means to know. So God is all powerful, omnipotent, all knowing, omniscient, but also, and this is, I think, from the perspective of understanding history, perhaps the one we need to focus on, he's omnipresent, which means he's present everywhere. I should add, by the way, that those three things are triune, that God's omnipotence, omniscience, and omnipresence are not three separate things, but three characteristics of a triune, a trinity, in attributes that are divine. But the omnipresence, we sometimes don't think about it perhaps as much as God's omnipotence and omniscience. And when we do, I think sometimes we don't get it wrong, but we don't get it fully right. Because I think when many of us think of God's omnipresence, we think that means that God's present everywhere. He's on my head, he's under the desk, he's out there in the chicken coop, and he's in all of your homes, all simultaneously, right? He's omnipresent, he's present everywhere. And that's true, of course. But I think that the deeper meaning of God's omnipresence is that everything is present to God. In other words, that for God there is no past. For God there is no future. The whole of human history is, not was, the whole of human history is in his presence. Now, when you understand history, if you like, from that divine perspective, you begin to realize, not only has God seen it all before, God is seeing it all at once, right? And there's a happy ending beyond this story. Now, the two other attributes of God that I think also play into this is that God is the creator. His creation is a work of art. So I look out my windows now, I can see that the trees with their resplendent full colors are still beautiful white wild flowers out there, which are just like snow on the ground. It's beautiful. We should really just be able to, however down we're feeling, be able to take one look at God's masterpiece. And a sunrise, for instance, is a different masterpiece every morning. No two sunrises are unique. I mean, those two ones sometimes are the same. They're all unique, and not just unique as a work of art like a landscape painting. They're a moving work of art. In other words, they're unique in every minute that you're looking at them because the lights change and everything else. We should be able to have, however bad things seem to be in the world, we should be able to look at God's creation and our hearts should be lifted up. We should be edified. And the definition of prayer is our hearts and minds being lifted up into God's presence. When we see the beauty of God's creation, that should be enough in itself to lift our heart and minds up into his presence as a prayer. So that's something worth bearing in mind also. And Jeremiah Hopkins, the great Jesuit poet, said in his poem, God's Grandeur, the world is charged with the grandeur of God. It shines out. So, so God is the creator. The Greek word for to create, by the way, is poiesis, for which we get the word poet, right? So we're living in a poem, all right? The creation is a poem, and the creation is moving through time. So in that sense, history is a poem. The other thing about God is that he is a storyteller. God tells stories. And the overarching story that God tells is history, right? The story of the human race through countless generations is a narrative that's playing out before us in God's presence. So this story, history, is his story. And then God himself chooses to enter his story, right? Through the incarnation. The author enters the work. And in the life, death, resurrection, ascension, descent of the Holy Spirit, founding of the church, the 2,000 years of the mystical body of Jesus Christ, which is the church, moving through the centuries, has been called quite rightly the greatest story ever told. So Jesus, in his life, death, resurrection, founding of the church, etc., is telling us the greatest story ever told. And within that story, he tells us stories. So for instance, apart from the most important story that he tells us, which is just looking at him as the story, the actual life and actions and words of Christ, he tells us parables. And to give just one example, perhaps the best known, the parable of the prodigal son. I don't want to be too controversial here, but the prodigal son never existed, nor did his father, nor did his brother, and most shocking of all, nor did the pigs. Now, none of them existed. They're all a figment of our Lord's imagination. It's a story, a work of fiction. It's the product of the divine imagination. We should be taking it seriously. But the prodigal son, unlike us, is not a historical figure. He's a fictional figure. But every time we have heard that story or read that story, since the time that the first very lucky audience who heard it from Christ's own lips, from that time onwards, we have been moved by that story to such a degree that we see within that story ourselves. We see ourselves as the prodigal son, perhaps as the forgiving father, perhaps as the envious brother. So we are in the story. And the story is so powerful that we don't say the prodigal son is like us. We say we are like the prodigal son. All right, so the prodigal son is an archetype, even though he's a fictional character, an archetype, if you like, who represents all of us. So this is the power of story, the power of narrative. So God, omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, a creator, the great artist, the great poet, and a storyteller. Various aspects of who the divine is. And as I said, I want to stress omnipresence and storytelling. Okay, now that's who is God. Now, who are we? Well, there are various labels that we've given ourselves. Some are not as smart as others. So the current scientific label for us, the name we give ourselves, is Homo sapiens. And this is a very new label for us. It's only about 200 years old. The earliest known use of the word Homo sapiens dates back to the early 19th century. And it's a very stupid label for who we are. Because if you know your Latin, Homo sapiens means wise man. In other words, what characterizes us as a species is our wisdom. Now, anybody knows anything about the human story is that wisdom's not the first thing that comes to mind. In fact, every generation makes the same mistakes as the previous generation because no new generation learns the lessons of previous generations. That's why we have a younger generation enamored of the idea of communism. And even though the communists killed tens of millions of people in the 20th century, there's no memory of that. They don't know anything about it, and they just have some romantic propagandized notion. So wisdom is not a characteristic of who we are. And what they really mean, by the way, their Latin is not good. They don't actually mean Homo sapiens. They mean something like to mix Latin and Greek, Homo techni, technological man, clever man. And there's a huge difference between cleverness and wisdom. All right. J.R.R. Tolkien in The Hobbit, the narrator says it's not unlikely that goblins invented many of the things that now curse our world, especially devices for killing large numbers of people at once. All right. So there's a big difference between cleverness and wisdom. Another thing that we are not, an even newer label for who we are, is Homo economicus. Right? We're just economic man. Basically, we're fundamentally selfish. We're producers and consumers. We're just cogs in the economic mechanism. And that's all we are, sort of ants, if you like, governed by selfishness. And that's what motivates us. A very reductionist understanding of who we are as human persons. So no, we're not Homo sapiens and we're not Homo economicus. If we want to know who we are, we have to go back to two older ancient labels for who we are. One is Greek and one is Latin. And just to keep us on track with the theme here, by the way, we will not understand history as his story unless we understand who we are within the story. We have to know who we are as people, right? We're not Homo sapiens, we're not Homo economicus. Who are we then? Well, the Greek word for man is anthropos. Maybe get words like anthropology. And what anthropos means in Greek is he who turns up, he who looks up. And the way I sometimes put this is that the animal grazes, but man gazes. The animal is a slave to instinct. It's constrained by what it is instinctively, by its biology. Human persons, on the other hand, yes, we have a biology and yes, we have instincts, but we also have something which transcends that instinct, that allows us to look up in wonder, to work out how long it takes the light to get from the sun to us, to work out where the stars are, to work out the chemical composition of a human body. I mean, we have all sorts of things that we can do. We can write poetry, like God's grandeur. Anthropos, he who looks up. Now, this understanding of reality was encapsulated by arguably the greatest ever Catholic philosopher and theologian, St. Thomas Aquinas. So Thomas Aquinas shows us how we engage with reality as individuals, how we perceive, the path of perception. And he says, and there are five parts of it. It begins with virtue, and specifically the first of the virtues. Now, if I were to ask a question, it's not really necessarily the format to do that, but if I was to ask a question, what is the greatest of the virtues? Many of you would quite correctly say love, right? Echoing St. Paul. Why would you not? And I'm going to put a but, and it's not because I'm disagreeing, I'm going to explain. If I was to then ask you what is the worst of all the sins, you would probably say pride. Now, because evil does not have existence, God does not create evil things. Evil, according to St. Augustine, is a privation. It's the absence of the good. That's what the definition of evil is, the absence of the good. That's why Tolkien talks about the shadow, right? The evil forces are the shadow, those that have blocked out the light, have turned their back on the light. So if we understand that, then the greatest, if the greatest of the sins is pride, the greatest of the virtues can be seen as humility, because the definition of pride is the absence of humility. Because pride doesn't have any existence in itself, of course, being an evil thing. It's a privation, something which doesn't exist. So pride can be defined as the absence of humility. So if the first and worst of sins is the absence of humility, right, then the first and best of virtues is humility itself. Now, I would say that love is what humility is called to. And I would also say that God is love. In that sense, of course, all grace, all supernatural assistance that we get is an act of love from God. And without that act of love from God, we cannot respond at all. So love is first in that sense, in that it's divine. But we will not be able to return that love from God with love unless we have humility. Right? Because the absence of humility, pride is puts ourselves first. Love is always putting ourselves second or third or fourth or last. So understanding, so Thomas Aquinas says that being able to perceive anything requires, first of all, the virtue of humility. And then the fruit of humility is a sense of gratitude. And the fruit of the sense of gratitude is a sense of wonder. And it's wonder that leads us to contemplation. And contemplation leads to what Thomas Aquinas calls dilatatio, dilation, the opening of the mind and the soul into the fullness of the real. Okay, so if you really want to get to connect with the fullness of reality, which of course is the reality which is God's creation, to see God as being present in his creation, you have to follow that path of perception: humility, gratitude, wonder, contemplation, then dilation, opening of the mind and the heart into the fullness of the real. So that's anthropos. That's the way we have to see. We have to see by looking up in wonder. A failure to do that means that we will not get to that. No wonder, there'll be no contemplation. If there's no contemplation, there'll be no dilation. In fact, what there will be in the absence is a shriveling. Pride and prejudice. The great philosopher Jane Austen put those two together. Pride and prejudice are always connected. If we won't allow ourselves to be open through the act of wonder and contemplation, we will shrivel. This is an example I give sometimes of this to try to make sense of it. That imagine there's a Catholic, a Protestant, a Muslim, an atheist, an agnostic, did I say Jew? I throw Jew in, right? So these six people, and they walk not into a bar, but into a field. And they walk into a field in the middle of the night. It's pitch black. And they sit down in the field facing east. At some point, the sky will change. It will get brighter. And I wrote a poem once called Summer Solstice when I was living back in England. Midsummer, late June, it gets light about 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the morning. And I couldn't sleep, and I was walking out in the countryside where I lived. And I saw it just started to get light. And first we could just see the silhouettes of the trees. But then you could sort of make out the shapes of the trees. The sky got lighter. And at some point, the sun rose. You could see it. And it was white as snow. You could look directly at it. And it reminded me as a Catholic, of course, of the elevation of the host. God's elevating himself to give me a new day. Of course, if these people in in the field, only the Catholic, it's this white sunrises, will get that symbol, the others won't. And then the sun turned from white to red. And you can still look directly at it. And by this stage, the sky itself is turning purple and pink and shades of red. And then the sun got a bit higher, it became gold, and you had to turn your face away. Now, in my poem, I used that changing of the color of the sun, the white to represent the joyful mysteries of the rosary, the red to represent the sorrowful mysteries of the rosary, and the gold to represent the glorious mysteries of the rosary. God, if you like, revealing himself in his deepness through that vision. Contemplation leading to dilation. Okay. Now, let's go back then. Imagine that our 6 people with different beliefs, different understandings of the world, all facing east and seeing this. They won't get the joyful mysteries of the rosary, but they will experience something which is transcendent, something which is beautiful. And if, insofar as they see that that's beautiful, they will say to themselves and perhaps to each other, it's good that we're here to see this. And with that sense of gratitude comes an obvious question. Who do I thank for this? And then you start asking those fundamental philosophical questions that lead towards the divine. Now, imagine the 6 people and then add a 7th. The 7th person we stick out there in the field in the middle of the night facing east is Gollum from the Lord of the Rings. When the sun comes up, Gollum doesn't want to gaze at it. He wants to hide, find a shadow, a hole to hide in. And it's possible for us, through our pride, through our refusal to have a sense of wonder, because we have no humility, therefore we have no sense of gratitude, to shrivel, to shrink, to become a hideous parody of who we're meant to be. Now, the characters of history, his story, are on a spectrum between Anthropos, who sees with wonder to such a degree that he's not just a poet, he's a saint. St. Thomas Aquinas, for instance, not just a great philosopher, he wrote some of the greatest hymns of the church. So that's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum are the Golems, those who are so enslaved to sin that they don't want to get involved in any of the Anthropos stuff. And these people are living with each other in the whole of human history. That's the interaction that's going on. That's the tension that's going on. These are the characters in the story. Right. The other label for who we are is Homo viator, so Latin. Anthropos is Greek, Homo viator is Latin. And this is man on a journey, or traveling man, or man on a quest, or pilgrim man, man on a pilgrimage. In other words, the understanding that each of our lives is both a journey and a story. That's why we talk about a life's journey and a life story. Our own lives are a story, and we are characters in the bigger story. That's what Homo viator means. And of course, the great literature, and that's what I do, great literature is either Anthropos or Homo viator. In other words, poetry such as Jeremiah Hopkins there, which shows us the beauty of the cosmos and God's presence in it, or the storytellers that show us ourselves. And Tolkien says that fairy stories hold up a mirror to man. They show us ourselves. Okay. Once we understand that, who God is, most important from the perspective of how history is his story, is his omnipresence, and who we are, most important is understanding what we're not, Homo sapiens or Homo economicus, what we are, Anthropos, called to look up. We're all in the gutter, says Oscar Wilde, but some of us are looking at the stars. We need to be looking at the stars, because if we're not, we're going to be looking in the gutter. And if we're looking in the gutter too long, we're going to end up in the gutter. So Anthropos and Homo viator, to understand that our lives are a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the whole purpose of our life, the only purpose of our life ultimately, is to have the happily ever after that comes at the end of every good story. In other words, the whole purpose of life is to get to heaven. There is no other purpose to life. So we have to have that goal in mind as we keep our eyes gazing upward towards the divine, towards God. We want to get to him at the end of our life's journey, the end of our life's story. Now, when you understand all this, one thing you do understand is because the progressives make the mistake. I'm putting progressive in inverted commas here. I'll talk about progress in a deeper sense in a moment, but progressives are working towards, they're on the right side of history. So they don't see history as his story. They see history as some sort of magical mechanism that's sort of working towards, even though there's no God, no guide, no one that made the mechanism, right? It's a sort of it's a miraculous accident. But this mechanism is sort of inexorably moving towards a golden age in the future. Right? Everything's going to be better in the future. The past is primitive. The future is good. This is the narrative that's at the heart of the progressive way of seeing things. So, and there's a certain type of conservative that's the other way around. That the golden age was in the past, right? And we're never going to get it back again. It's gone. Things are going to get inexorably worse from now on, right? And that way of seeing things, by the way, is leads to despair, right? It leads to a lack of hope, and despair is a mortal sin, and it leads to suicide. So any conservative, and heaven forbid any conservative or traditional Catholic that has that view of things, is on a very dangerous path. So when the golden age in literature is sometimes called a utopia, right? So St. Thomas More wrote a book called Utopia. And we sometimes think utopia means the good place, the golden age in the future. No, from the topos in Greek is place, and utopia is good place. Okay, so we often translate utopia as the good place, the golden age, right? But in actual fact, the way that Thomas More used it is utopia ou, which means no place, right? It's holding this up. This place is not going to exist. It's good for us to look at it because you might learn lessons by this imaginary place that's nowhere, in the no place, but we can learn lessons from it. So that's for stories like 1984, which are no place, but they are dystopia, the bad place. But by looking at the bad place, we can be warned, right? That if we don't heed lessons, then Big Brother could actually become our ruler. So the golden age, if from a Christian perspective, there's only two golden ages. One is gone forever, and the other is in the future, but not in the future of history. So the golden age in the past is Eden, from which the Garden of Eden, from which we fell. That we cannot get back to the garden, as the hippies used to say, right? It's impossible to get back to the garden. And a lot of the progressive thing, yes, we can. We can get back to the garden. No, impossible. That abyss cannot be crossed. But the golden age is the eternity with our Lord in heaven. That's the golden age. And that comes at the end of the world. And the end of the world for us is next week or tomorrow or maybe this afternoon. In other words, at the end of the world for us, our story, our life story, is the end of our life. We don't need to be worrying about what the world's going to be like 1,000 years from now, because we were not made for this world. We're made for the other place. And when our story ends, which it will fairly soon, I'm older than most of you, so presumably end sooner for me than for most of you, but we don't know. I mean, I've had friends that have just killed over with cardiac arrest, younger than I am. We don't know when the story will end, which is why we have to stay awake, stay in a state of grace. So that's the end of history for us. The end of our story is the end of his story for us. And we get to heaven and we're in his omnipresence in a much deeper sense. Um, uh, if we're in the beatific vision, if we're in heaven. Okay, so the only golden age is paradise, and that's the only golden age we should be looking towards. Progress is progress towards paradise. So a progressive, properly understood without the quotation marks, is a saint. It's the saint who's making progress. And not just for himself, by the way, because one of the consequences of sanctity is that shines forth. It's like a light in the darkness, that other people make progress because we're making progress. Now, on a societal level, so society can be said to be progressing insofar as it is becoming more virtuous, because it's progressing towards the good in an absolute sense. Insofar as a society is becoming less virtuous, it's regressing, even if it's calling itself progressive. So progress is always moving, actually, not horizontally through time into a future that we can't see. It's actually, progress is moving towards the center, towards the presence of God. That's what progress is. So if you like, you see it as moving up, looking up, desiring God, not looking for what the world's going to be like 500 years from now. Progress is moving towards God's omnipresence. So throughout history, the heroes are the saints. There is an indissoluble marriage, if you like, between heroism and holiness. In actual fact, for a Christian understanding of things, they're the same thing. That to be holy is to be a hero. So, for instance, I wrote a book, A History of the Reformation, and it was called Heroes of the Catholic Reformation. And it's about the saints, but the word we used was heroes. So heroism and holiness are synonyms, and then sanity and sanctity are also synonyms, right? Insofar as you attain sanctity by the grace of God, you are becoming sane. Sin is ultimately a madness that leads us away, leads us astray, makes us slaves. You know, it doesn't matter how much we say I have the right to do what I like. I'm addicted to sexual activity, to heroin, to alcohol, to any drug or any behavior. If I'm an addict, I do not have freedom. I am a slave, even if I demand the right to do what I'm doing. Okay, so sorry, that was almost a Freudian slip. I was going to say Saint Benedict the 16th. That's a bit. He's not even dead yet. But he said, I can't remember where it was now, the source, but forgive me. He said ultimately the only argument for the church are the saints that she's raised and the beautiful works of art that she's produced. And so this is Benedict XVI really referring to God as the good, the true, and the beautiful. And I believe that when Christ described himself as I am the way, the truth, and the life, he was saying, I am the good, the true, and the beautiful. The way of goodness is love. The true is reason, fides et ratio, faith and reason, that God's not irrational, the Catholic faith is not irrational, that reason leads us to him. So I am the way of love, I am the truth of reason, and I am the life of beauty. That it's beauty that brings something to life. When we see the order, the harmony, God's life in it. So what he's saying there is ultimately that, of course, reason is incredibly important, but the fruits ultimately are holiness, the saints, and glorious works of beauty. When we look at St. Peter's Basilica, well, let me give you a quick example before we go through history as his story in terms of the chronology. Let's tell a story, as that's the way that we're meant to understand things. Once upon a time, there was a rock, and it was actually a very beautiful rock, but nobody had ever seen it because it was under the ground and it had been there for millions of years. And then, using human cleverness, technology, the rock was dug up. So for the first time, the rock could be seen by people. And people were looking at this rock and saying, that's actually a very beautiful rock. And then someone came along and said, that's not a beautiful rock. That is the beautiful rock. And that person then started doing things to that rock. When we go into St. Peter's Basilica in Rome and we turn to the right as we walk through the doors and we see Michelangelo's Pieta with the mother of Christ cradling her dead son in that beautiful statue, we see the power of beauty. We also see the power of man made in God's image as one who is himself a creator, who takes God's things, God's creation, does things with them and makes something beautiful. Now, it's a bit like the sunset or the sunrise I mentioned earlier. Everybody who's not a golem, who's seen that statue, whether they're Protestant, Catholic, atheist, Jew, agnostic, Muslim, insofar as they understand the kiss of beauty when it's presented to them, they have seen that image of Christ and his mother following our Lord's death on the cross, and their mind and heart is moved up, is lifted up, is edified. And exactly as when we see the sunrise. And a definition of prayer is the lifting up of the mind and heart to God. So the experience of beauty is prayer. So this is what Benedict XVI is saying here, that to understand history, and especially the history of the church, keep your eyes on the saints and the beautiful works of art, architecture, music, literature. So if God is the good, the true, and the beautiful, I would say that history is the good, the bad, and the beautiful. Right? Because we keep our eyes on the saints, the good, keep our eyes on the beautiful, but the absence of both is evil. The absence of goodness is evil. The absence of beauty is ugliness, which is evil. So history is the good, the bad, and the beautiful. And let's look now at the history of the church, or the history of the world, if you like, in the last 2,000 years, to see that there's not that the same pattern, if you like, is being woven in every generation from the time of Christ to today. And it's three threads that are woven in this tapestry, which is the human story, which is his story, which is history. And that's the thread of goodness, the thread of badness, and the thread of beauty. Weave that through. So the early church, we often romanticize the early church. And so, of course, there were so many saints in the early church, and the spread of the faith was miraculous. From 11 men, because one of them betrayed our Lord, to a faith which conquered the world in many ways within 3 or 4 centuries. But it was also an age of martyrdom. Most of those saints were martyrs. So we need to bear that in mind. And the seed of the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, absolutely. But look ourselves in the eye. If you like, look in the mirror, look yourself in the eye. Are you ready for martyrdom? And many of us, even if we're trying to grow in faith, would hesitate to say yes. All right. So the early church was a glorious time of goodness and beauty, but also of ugliness and evil, where Christians were being put to death by the secular power. Then we have the so-called Dark Ages, which is an oversimplification, but it is true that when Rome fell, there was an age in which the barbarians triumphed for a while, and it was only again the saints, especially perhaps Saint Benedict, who took the original Benedict option and built these monasteries, which in the end became, first of all, just places where Christians could live the gospel in an age of darkness and despair and violence. But these monasteries then became the center of villages and the center of towns. They became the hub and the heart of a regenerative, resurrected Christian civilization. And in the Middle Ages, I'm actually writing a book at the moment, to which I've given the title Faith of Our Fathers, A History of True England, so a history of Catholic England. And you go through this. In the Middle Ages, it's a time of profound faith, lots of beautiful cathedrals being built, great works of literature. But the Middle Ages also, if you look at Dante's Divine Comedy, you know, for every saint in heaven, there's a sinner in hell. If you look at Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, look at the general prologue. Now, for every saintly parson, there's a drunken, lascivious friar, a monk. So, you know, the corruption inside the church, corruption outside the church, saints inside the church, the good, the bad, and the beautiful. In the 16th century, we had the Reformation. And the only Reformation that really matters is the Catholic Reformation. And it's possible that we would not have had the glories of what is sometimes called the Counter-Reformation without the Protestant Reformation. I'm not saying the Protestant Reformation was good, but I am saying that God can and does bring good out of evil. And the Jesuit order arose from that. St. Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross, the Discalced Carmelites, the renewal and resurrection of the Carmelite order, this new order of missionary priests, the Jesuits that were going through. And just when parts of Europe were reneging on the faith, a much larger part of the world was turning to the faith, not least of which through Marian miracles such as Our Lady of Guadalupe. But again, we can always rely on God's kiss through miraculous intervention as and when and if it's needed. So let's look at that to try to get the picture now then of history. The history of the world in broad strokes are the facts, if you like, the molecules, if you want to be a materialist. And of course, we need to know the facts. You've got to know what something's made of. But actually, what's more important as regards history, is what is it painted with? And the paint is who we are. Human history is painted with human stories. And of course, who we are depends upon how we respond to the ultimate artist, the ultimate storyteller. And this is why history is his story. He's not absent, he's present. He's not just present, he's omnipresent. He's always present. He's as present to us as he is to the saints of the early church, to the martyrs of England in the 16th century, when it was illegal in England to be a priest, punishable by death to be a priest, punishable by death to harbor a priest from the authorities, to hide a priest from the authorities. St. Anne Line, this beautiful woman who was put to death, was hanged for harboring a Catholic priest. Basically, her home was raided while Mass was going on. The Jesuit priest who was celebrating Mass managed to get his vestments off and hide them away and mingle into the congregation before the authorities burst in. So the priest got away. But because it was Anne Lyne's house, she was arrested, sent to prison, and was sentenced to be hanged. And when it's put to her in the court, did you harbor a priest? She said, yes, and were but for every one I harbored, I could have harbored 1,000. That's sanctity. That's holiness. That's heroism. And it's in a time of darkness. Things might be bad in the United States, but no one yet is saying that to be a priest is punishable by death, to go to church is punishable by death. So we have to understand that history has God's presence, and that means that history is theocentric, that God is at the center and at the heart of history. Progress, true progress, is moving towards the center, moving towards the center of history, which is moving towards God, which is moving towards God as he entered history, which is Jesus Christ. Our own personal history is our life, and our place in history is our place in his story. Does our story lead us to him so that we can be with him forever, beyond history, in that other story, the best story of all, where we will live happily ever after? And I'm going to finish with some words of C.S. Lewis. Now, I don't know how many of you have read the Chronicles of Narnia, but if you haven't, you should. And the final book in the Chronicles of Narnia is called The Last Battle, and it's the apocalypse. It's the end of Narnia. It's the end of the world. And then they have this vision of Aslan, who's the divine figure. He's basically the son of the emperor over the sea. He's the Christ figure in the stories, and of course, he's a lion. This is one of the most beautiful descriptions of heaven that I've ever read, of what heaven must be like. It rivals Dante. And C.S. Lewis's brilliance is he does it in a children's story. This is the end of the final book of the Chronicles of Narnia, The Last Battle. And as he spoke, he no longer looked to them like a lion. But the things that began to happen after that were so great and beautiful that I cannot write them. And for us, this is the end of all the stories. And we can most truly say that they all lived happily ever after. But for them, it was only the beginning of the real story. All their life in this world and all their adventures in Narnia had only been the cover and the title page. Now at last, they were beginning chapter 1 of the great story, which no one on earth has read, which goes on forever, in which every chapter is better than the one before. A depiction of the story we're all trying to get into. Beyond his story here is the everlasting story with him there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joseph. That was amazing. I took 4 pages of notes, and I could probably take 4 more. That was just fantastic. I'd like to open us up to Q&A, Joseph, if you have some time. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to share a slide with everyone. I'm sure everyone is curious about how to learn more about Joseph and his work. So I encourage you to go to his personal website, which is jpearce.co. I would also encourage you to subscribe to the St. Austin Review. It's a phenomenal literary magazine, brilliant writing, fantastic. I encourage you to get it. It's great. And also follow his thought-provoking essays on the Imaginative Conservative website. So if you're looking for ways to follow Joseph and his work and get access to his books, these are just some links. So I will, excuse me one second, I will look at our chat because we've already had some questions submitted, and I'm going to do my best to get all of these get you to answer all of these if we can. From Ted, Joseph, he says, Bishop Sheen spoke of having 4 deaths in our Christian history and how it came to life again each time. Of the 22 civilizations in his story that have decayed, 19 rotted and perished from within. Is his story in Western civilization right now dying, dead, or poised to rise again?
Great question. Well, G.K. Chesterton said, and that was that Fulton Sheen.
Bishop Sheen,
Yeah.
yes.
So I'm guessing that in that particular book he quoted Chesterton's this particular quote by Chesterton. He says that uh, the church has died and has been killed on many occasions, but she always is resurrected
Mhm.
because she worships a God who knows the way out of the grave. So the point is that the secular aspects of history, that part of history which belongs to the world, is always passing away. And none of us should presume that any secular aspect of civilization is permanent.
Mhm.
All of them die and decay. They come to life insofar as they have goodness and truth and beauty. The church the church needs to be understood. There's two ways you can understand the church, and only one is actually ultimately useful. You can see the church in a worldly sense as a human institution made up of human persons over 2,000 years, as something fundamentally human, just like the United States or the United Kingdom. Or you can see it ecclesiologically as the mystical body of Jesus Christ. And also as the bride of Christ, two different labels, and they're not just symbols. Now, we believe in indissolubility of marriage. The church is the one flesh, which is both Christ's mystical body and his bride. Now, when you understand the church in that sense, then yes, individual cells of the body, us, will die. But that new cells will be there in our place in the next generation. That human aspect of the church means that there is sickness within on occasion. And in many ways, the miracle of the church is how the many evil people that have been in positions of authority in the church, including popes, over the 2,000 years, have not managed to destroy it. That's the miracle. The miracle is not that we've had 2,000 years of saintly popes. The miracle is we've had more bad popes than good. And in spite of that, the church is still here. And it's still here because it is ultimately divine. So what I would say is that, yes, how are we defining Western civilization? If we're defining Western civilization as Christendom, now that aspect of the world which owes its allegiance to the church, then it's not going to pass away until the end of time. But if we mean that Western civilization is those ideas that have grown up in the history of the West, in Athens and Jerusalem and Rome, and then Germany, the Enlightenment, and all these bad ideas that have entered into the picture over the last 500 years, especially, then no, that civilization, I would say that civilization is in the process of killing itself. That, as John Paul II said, St. John Paul II said, that this is a culture of death. And the thing about the culture of death is it's deadly. And the thing about its deadliness is that it's suicidal. So I sometimes say that if you give the devil enough rope, he'll hang himself. If you give him enough power, he'll hang us first. And that is also a pattern woven through his story of history. So we see now what's playing itself out is the radical secularism that led to the atheism of some of the philosophers of the Enlightenment, such as Hobbes, and the French Revolution with its guillotines against God, with its abolition of the church, with its establishment of the goddess Reason in the in Notre Dame Cathedral, and of course, what happened to the French Revolution? It died. It killed itself. In fact, in a reign of terror, after they guillotined Christians, they started guillotining each other. Same thing happened in the Soviet Union. So we don't have to defeat evil because evil is always in the process of defeating itself. We do have to resist evil, otherwise we become evil. So there's a struggle against evil, but we don't have to think about that's far too powerful. It doesn't matter how big it is if it's self-destructive. right? What we have to do is stay true to the truth himself until we get to the end of history, which is the end of our lives. In other words, we don't have to worry about the big picture, because the big picture of the future of his story here is minute compared to the big picture, which is heaven.
Thank you, Joseph. And as I'm reading these questions, we have about 10 minutes left. If you have other questions to submit, please do so now. This is from Lisa, Joseph, and she asks simply, how does art contribute to wonder, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, there's two ways of understanding the famous maxim that the beauty is in the eye of the beholder. The incorrect way is that basically beauty is just what I see, right? So it's nothing that exists in itself. You might find that beautiful, I might not like it. No, beauty is in the thing beheld. The sunrise is beautiful, and if Gollum can't see it, it's not because the sunrise is not beautiful, it's because Gollum is blind. Okay, so the eye of the beholder, it's only true that beauty in the eye of the beholder in the sense that our ability to see will limit our ability to perceive the beautiful. And it's virtue, humility, that opens the eyes to the sense of wonder which perceives beauty. So beauty, because of its reflecting the goodness, truth, beauty, the life of God, is a witness. It's a light in the darkness. I mentioned the sunrise. I've also mentioned Michelangelo's Pieta, that a great work of art is a witness to the goodness, truth, and beauty of God. And that's why art is essential. Great literature, the visual arts, architecture, music. It's the other strand, as Benedict XVI said, apart from the holiness of the saints, is the beauty of the edifice that the church has erected in 2,000 years of her art.
Excellent. Thank you. Joseph, this is from Tom, who starts out by saying, thank you for your time and sharing your wisdom. But he asks, as a starting out Christian, where do you recommend we begin in growing our relationship with God? Are there any practices, books, or authors that you recommend? So Tom is a relatively new Christian, and he's asking for a starting point in your point of view.
Well, Tom, first of all, welcome home. The key thing is that in our particular culture now, the danger for all of us is we can distract ourselves to death. So I would say you have to find time and space in your daily life for time away from technology. You need to find time for prayer, obviously. And prayer, I would suggest, should be in two parts. You should have formal prayer, absolutely. Now, I won't specify which types of formal prayer. You should pray for individuals every single day to connect you in loving your neighbor. But you should also try to nurture and nourish a sense of silence, where you just go out away from any screens, away from any noise, and let the beauty of God's presence in his creation be there. I might even use the word speak, just to be in his presence. So cultivate silence, cultivate proactive prayer, praying for your neighbors, and also you definitely formal prayer. But the most important thing is time and space every day, unplugging from the many distractions that this world offers. Because without that heart, holiness can't grow.
Excellent. And I think we'll end with this one, Joseph. I have heard it said that every 500 years, God intervenes by bringing saints to correct problems in the church. In this century, who do you think God is using?
Yeah, I would only correct that maybe in the sense that I think God is always sending saints, and I think all of us are called to be saints in every generation. But certainly the 20th century is a very interesting century. It's the darkest and bloodiest, perhaps, in human history, in certain terms of the number of people killed. Because, with technology now, we can kill lots of people much more efficiently. So the communists, for instance, of course, killed tens of millions. There were two world wars and other wars. It was a bloody, gruesome time. And yet, no, we have great saints. A couple of days ago, we celebrated the feast of Blessed Karl of Austria, who attempted to avert the hideous bloodshed of World War One, but no one listened to him. The fate of the saint often enough. Yesterday, we celebrated the feast of St. John Paul II, whose fearless "Be Not Afraid" speech in Poland, which caused the solidarity movement to take off, was a domino effect that brought down the whole Soviet empire. A great saint. We got St. Maximilian Kolbe, who died in the Nazi concentration camp. We got Edith Stein, St. Teresa of the Cross, who also died in a Nazi concentration camp as witnesses. So that we've got St. Jose Maria Escrivá, the founder of Opus Dei. I mean, the 20th century was a century of great saints. Every century is a century of great saints. And we need to be part of the little part of the story, of his story we're part of, our own generation, our own 80 years and 10, if we get that far. We have to try to become saints ourselves. And one reassuring thing is, of course, that there are two types of saints. There are those canonized by the church who are on the calendar, and there are those numerous other saints that are not formally recognized, that are nonetheless in heaven. We have to aim to be one of those. And that's our goal in life, is to become one of the saints. And insofar as we succeed, we will be bringing others towards Christ at the same time.
Thank you, Joseph. In my consulting life, when I end a session, I often remind my audience, based on what you've heard today, what will you start doing? What will you stop doing? And what will you continue doing? So everybody that was on the call today probably took their own nuggets of wisdom from what Joseph Pearce has shared. There were so many. It was an endless series of great nuggets of wisdom. So I would just encourage all of us, as I think John Reardon and Deacon Mike would, to reflect on what you've heard today and maybe frame it up with, as Joseph said so eloquently, think about who is God, who are we, what is our role in his story, and does our story lead us to him? And then the great reminder that Joseph shared, we are made for heaven and we're not made for this world. So we have a lot of choices after this call. We could dive into the Twitter storm. We could watch TV. We could do a number of things that will distract us and anger us and frustrate us and divide us. Or we could be silent and pray and do things that will help us contribute to a story that leads us to heaven. So I just want to encourage everybody to reflect on what you got from this morning. Joseph, again, on behalf of Deacon Mike and John Reardon, I just want to thank you. The messages have been coming in left and right from the audience about how much they appreciated this. Your time is precious, and we're grateful that you gave us the gift of your time this morning.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. It's been a joy. God bless you all.
God bless you. Take care. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.